So get this. You're seeing someone. Things feel good. Maybe not perfectly defined, but good. And then out of nowhere, they go a little quiet. They pull back. They're still there technically, but something feels slightly different. The texts come a little slower. They seem more in their head. And your brain, being the threat detection machine that it is, immediately jumps to the worst possible interpretation. They're losing interest. Something changed. You did something. And you spend the next 3 days replaying every conversation trying to figure out what went wrong. What if I told you that sometimes, not always, but more often than people realize, that pullback is actually a sign that someone is catching feelings they weren't quite prepared for? I want to sit with that for a second because I think it genuinely reframes something that causes a lot of unnecessary panic in early dating. The assumption most people carry is that distance equals disinterest, that if someone liked you, they'd be moving toward you, not away from you. And on the surface, that logic seems reasonable. But human beings are not actually that straightforward when it comes to vulnerability. And the moment real emotional attachment starts to form, a lot of people don't lean in gracefully. They wobble. They hesitate. They create a little space to try to figure out what they're feeling before they do anything about it. So, let's actually talk about what this looks like and why it happens. Because I think understanding the psychology behind it changes how you respond to it entirely. The first thing worth understanding is that emotional attachment and emotional readiness are two completely separate things. Someone can be genuinely developing feelings for you and simultaneously be completely unprepared for what those feelings mean for their life, their independence, their past experiences, their sense of control. Attachment doesn't arrive with a neat little bow on it. For a lot of people, especially those who've been hurt before or who have strong independent identities, the early stages of catching feelings can feel genuinely disorienting, like standing on ground that used to be solid and realizing it started to shift a little under your feet. And the instinctive response to that feeling for many people is to take a step back and find their footing before they go any further. Here's something I've noticed over the years, and I felt this myself too. When someone truly doesn't care about you, their pullback looks different from when they do. When there's no real attachment, the distance is clean. They drift without much thought. They stop initiating. They become genuinely unbothered. There's no tension in it. But when someone is pulling back because they're attached, there's almost always a texture to it, a kind of friction. They're slightly warmer when you do connect, even if the connections are less frequent. They might say something small that reveals they've been thinking about you. They check in almost in spite of themselves. The distance has this quality of effort to it, like they're maintaining it rather than it coming naturally. And that distinction, maintenance versus drift, is one of the clearest signals you can watch for if you know what you're looking for. Now, I want to talk about some of the specific ways this actually shows up in behavior, because I think naming them concretely makes this easier to recognize, rather than just sitting in the abstract idea of it. One of the most common patterns is what I describe as the slowdown without the disappearance. They're not ghosting you, they're not cold, but there's a deliberateness to their availability that wasn't there before. Like they're carefully managing how much of themselves they're giving you at once. Sometimes this is completely unconscious. They're not sitting there calculating anything. They just feel a pull toward you that scares them a little. And so they instinctively moderate it. If you pay attention, there's usually still warmth when you're together or when you do talk. The foundation hasn't changed. The frequency has. Another thing that comes up is a sudden need to assert their independence. You'll notice them mentioning their plans more, their friends, their life outside of you. Sometimes this feels like they're trying to remind you, but honestly, I think they're often reminding themselves. Like they're saying to their own nervous system, I still have a whole life here. I'm not disappearing into this person. It's a self-regulation thing more than a message to you, even if it ends up landing like one. There's also a pattern that I find really telling where someone pulls back emotionally, but then does something unexpectedly thoughtful. They remembered something you mentioned weeks ago. They send you something small but specific to an inside joke or a conversation you had. It almost doesn't make sense alongside the distance, which is exactly why it's worth noticing. Indifferent people don't do that. Indifferent people forget the details. Someone who is emotionally attached but also pulling back will often let those small things slip through because the attachment is real, even when the presence is regulated. And then there's the one that I think catches people most off guard, which is when someone pulls back right after a particularly good moment. A really great date. A conversation that went deeper than either of you expected. A moment where you both felt genuinely seen. And then the next day, or the day after, they're quieter than usual, and your instinct is to think you imagined how good it was, or that it didn't land the same way for them. But sometimes, and this is important, sometimes people retreat specifically because something felt too good, because they felt too much. And that emotional intensity triggers something, a kind of self-protective response that makes them want to create a little distance before they go any further. I remember being on the other side of this once, pulling back from someone I actually really liked. And at the time, I couldn't have fully explained why. It wasn't that I was unsure about him. It was more that I suddenly became aware of how much I was starting to care. And it felt like standing at the top of something really high. And my instinct was to slow down. Look at the view for a minute. Make sure I actually wanted to jump before I did. Not because the jump wasn't worth it, but because the height of it caught me off guard. I think a lot of people who pull back when they're emotionally attached are standing in a version of that same place. Now, here's where I want to be careful, because this is the part that tends to get oversimplified. Not every pullback is a hidden sign of attachment. Some people pull back because they genuinely are losing interest. Some pull back because they're dealing with something in their personal life that has nothing to do with you. Some pull back because they met someone else, or because they're not in a headspace for anything real right now. Context matters enormously here. And it would be dishonest of me to suggest that distance always means depth of feeling. What I'm describing are specific patterns, specific textures that tend to accompany attachment-driven withdrawal, as opposed to disinterest-driven withdrawal. And learning to read the difference takes honest observation, not wishful thinking. So, what do you actually do if you're in this situation? If you're looking at someone's behavior and you're seeing some of what I've described, what's the right response? The most counterproductive thing you can do is chase. And I know that sounds obvious, but in practice, it's genuinely hard not to do. Because when someone you like creates distance, your nervous system reads it as a threat, and your instinct is to close the gap. But if someone is pulling back because they're emotionally overwhelmed by their own feelings, more pursuit doesn't usually make them feel safer. It can actually amplify the overwhelm. It confirms that you're becoming a significant presence in their life, right at the moment when they're trying to catch their breath about what that means. What tends to work better? And I want to be clear, this isn't about playing games as holding your own, staying warm but not anxious, being present in a grounded way without flooding them with your availability or your need for reassurance. If you're secure in yourself and in what you bring to the dynamic, you can give them that moment of space without it destabilizing you. And that steadiness, that quiet confidence that you're not going anywhere, and you're also not going to fall apart, is often exactly what allows someone to come back toward you when they've regulated themselves. Attachment-driven withdrawal is about someone trying to protect themselves from something they already feel, but haven't yet decided what to do with. They're not indifferent. In many ways, they're the opposite. And what they often need in those moments is the sense that when they do come back, things will still be good. That you haven't made their uncertainty into a crisis. That the space was safe to take without everything falling apart. That's a lot easier to offer when you understand what's actually happening. When you can look at the pullback and instead of reading it as rejection, read it as someone trying to figure out what they're feeling, which is something most of us have done at one point or another, without fully understanding it ourselves. There's something kind of human about it. Actually, the moment real feelings arrive, a lot of us become a little more careful than we were before. And that carefulness, as frustrating as it can be to be on the receiving end of, is sometimes the closest thing to honesty that a person can offer before they've figured out how to say the rest out loud.